You want to talk a bit about your list, Ian? Because I thought this was
Sure.
really interesting.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like that third tier is a little too much. There could be some more separation in there. I still think Lafreniere's in a league of a tier of his own. He's an extremely decorated prospect. I mean, he's won. They've announced the CHL Player of the Year, right? This
Yeah.
year, yeah, it was
Yeah.
him, and last year as well. And I think he was also best forward at the World Juniors tournament.
Hmm.
Yeah, if I'm mistaken on that, definitely first team All Star, but I think he was best team. Basically, he's coming into this with about as decorated of a resume as you can get, minus a Memorial Cup,
Yeah,
and
that's basically it.
yeah, and a QMJHL championship for that matter. But you know, things happen,
Hmm.
and that's not on him. And also, I mean, Connor McDavid never won a Memorial Cup either. So I mean, it's a that's getting a little too off. But long story short, with Lafreniere, he reminds me a lot of a prior Rimouski Oceanic pick that went first overall. Not Crosby, but Vinny Lecavalier. Um,
Nice. Yeah. Yeah, I like
yeah,
that.
little history bomb right there. And then I still have Byfield as the second because I think his ceiling is unbelievable. Um, he's a little raw still, in my opinion. He, I feel like this is not the best way to sell him for those that are learning about these prospects. But there is a little bit of caution with his game in the sense of when we picked Zaka. Yeah, um,
Here it comes.
yeah, exactly. No, it was just the idea of he's got all this skill and all this physicality and this just stature and skating, and can the
Yeah.
two come together? Now Byfield is a lot more polished and a lot more put together than Zaka was during his draft year, and I think
Mhm.
his ceiling is much higher. His ceiling is absolutely a 1C franchise center.
Yeah, it's something interesting about Byfield too. Like that Zaka comparison is really interesting. But Zach used his body much more effectively in terms of physical play in
That's
his
right.
draft year, whereas Byfield is massive. Like what he's at least 6'2", right? If not six
He's
foot
six
three,
four. He's
6'4".
well. I
But he
mean
doesn't.
the you know the
Yeah,
measurements.
yeah. And he's one of the youngest people in this draft class,
Yeah.
and he doesn't use his body in the same way. So
No.
like the success he's having isn't because he's that big. It's
Yeah.
because he's that skilled. And when the rest of it comes into play, you're like you said, you're going to have a really complete player.
Yeah. So I don't. I mean, if anything, if anybody in this top three has quote unquote bust potential, it's because of that not coming together, and that's really
Yeah.
not fair to Byfield because he's a remarkable talent, and I think whoever's going to pick him is going to be very lucky. But yeah, that's a really good point too about not physically dominating opponents,
And he
especially.
could, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
He's massive.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's not where his success comes from, which I think is really important, right? Because I mean, you've seen it all the time, like Lawson Krause, Pavel Zacha. I'm ashamed to say, like there are examples of players that can dominate in junior because they are so much more physically mature.
Yeah.
But that advantage tops out, right? Once you hit the
Mhm.
professional leagues.
Yeah.
So you need to have more than that. And I think Byfield, like you said, his ceiling is insane. So I
Yeah.
agree with having him too, but I know there are lots of people at this point that might disagree with you.
Yeah. I know that uh, I can't think off the top of my head. I know Cam Robinson from I think he's with Dauber has
Yeah.
Byfield at one
Hmm.
um, over Lafreniere simply based on the potential ceiling, and I
Yeah.
get that argument, but politely disagree. And then
Yeah.
there's some folks that have Byfield behind, who I have three. Tim Stutzel. We have him as a left wing here. Um, I think he can go either way. I like him better on the wing right now. He kind of reminds me of a more offensively. Uh, I know this is a really vague term, but he reminds me of a more offensively dynamic Sebastian Aho from
Mm.
the Hurricanes, not the Islanders. Sebastian Aho.
The good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and there's a lot. I mean, he's an exciting player to watch. We got to see that at the World Juniors with Germany playing for, and I don't really have much to say other than he's exciting, he's fast, he's a great playmaker, and His goal is to make the NHL next year, so that'll be really, really exciting.
Yeah. What about that third tier? Like who? Like, do you see a huge difference between like a Lucas Raymond and a Jack Quinn?
Not really, to be honest. I was very tempted to put Rossi at 4, but I just think Raymond's ceiling is a little higher. It may
Mhm.
not be as likely that he gets there, but I see a lot of Panarin in his game.
Mm.
Um, Great playmaker, great stick handler. We'll see what happens where he goes, because it's always a little difficult to tell with young kids, because they're kids, like 17, 18-year-old, that's
Yeah.
still a kid.
Young
um,
boys.
yeah. uh, Playing in the Swedish hockey league, the professional league, because a lot of times these kids don't get all that much ice time, and it just depends on the situation. So it's tough to get a good gauge on it, but I'm still very high on Raymond. Now I know a lot of people might disagree with that. That's cool. I'm fine with that.
Well, I saw
um,
something on Twitter today from Scott Wheeler at The Athletic, and he said, talking to some NHL scouts, um, NHL scouts, or at least some of the ones he's talked to, are, in his words, like a lot lower on Raymond than Twitter seems to be, which I thought was really interesting because,
yeah.
like you said, he is one of those prospects at the top of this draft that does have, I'd say like elite or like borderline elite potential. And the thought that he would belong closer to like pick number 10 than pick number 3 or 4 was really interesting to me because I don't necessarily see that. But at the same time, he didn't really earn a ton of ice time in the SHL this year. But
Yeah,
he's also like 17, 18 years old. So that's
but
pretty typical.
exactly. But also at the same time, I mean, there's a ton of other players who made significant arguments to be ahead of him with their performances this year. And the prime example of that would be Marco Rossi, who I have at 5. Um, just a fantastic player. I mean, his head coach, uh, his head coach, uh, wrote likened his game style to Nico Hischier, which is enough for us to like.
I'm
And
in. I mean,
yeah.
we've been on the Marco Rossi train for quite some time now.
Mm-hmm.
Incredible player, uh, led the CHL in scoring this
Yeah.
season.
Yeah.
Also happens
Over
to,
2 points per game, right?
yeah, 120 points in like 50 odd games. He also happens to be 5'9".
Yeah.
So there's that, but I'm not necessarily sure how much that matters because, um, he's got that incredible lower body strength. And
Oh
he's
yeah.
also very mean on the ice, which surprised me when I saw him play in person because I think I had built up this image of my mind, especially with like the Nico Hischier comparison.
Yeah.
Like Nico's such a nice boy. Like he's very polite. He'll take the puck from you, but he won't do it in like a terribly mean way. Rossi has a bit of like that. I don't want to say Brad Marchand streak, but something like that. Like he could be
Yeah.
really nasty.
Yeah. But incredibly, very, very high ceiling.
Mm.
And if there's size concern, shift him to wing. He'll be a really good defensively capable winger and also
Mhm.
be able to score points. Nothing. If it
Yeah.
wasn't for Stutzel, I could see Rossi going with 3rd overall.
Mhm.
It depends on who's picking, but this tier is very close together.
Can you tell me about Jake Sanderson? Because this has been a wild experience for me because
Yeah.
I wasn't the biggest fan of his game a month ago, and now people are talking like he has the potential to go top 5,
Yeah.
depending on if you need like if you like him as much as a Marco Rossi, but you happen to need a defenseman. The thought that he could jump to like a number 5 or 6 slot instead of like a Jaime Drysdale is interesting to me.
Yeah. I'll be honest. I'm a little. Um, I'm not as high on Sanderson,
Mhm.
but I also still view him as he's still quite a good prospect nonetheless. I mean, it's just the expectations that you're going to have from him.
Yeah.
He's When you watch him play, you immediately recognize that he's a very athletic player, and he skates very well, rock solid on defense. But the question is his offensive upside. And I think, honestly, if you're going to use a top 5 pick on a defenseman, I think that player should be able to have top pairing upside. And I think there's a difference between a player that has top pairing upside and a player that can be minute munching on the defensive side of things, that can play on the top pair.
So you think he's more the minute muncher than necessarily like a true top pairing defenseman?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is such a cop out, but of course we'll see what happens. He's committed to go to North Dakota, I think. So we'll see what happens there. But at this point, I think he's going to get picked top 10 just because of how safe of a player he is. He has a very high floor. Very much reminds me of like a Charlie McAvoy, not in terms of play style. If we're doing play style, I see a lot of Ryan McDonough out of him. But situation-wise, I see a lot of Charlie McAvoy in him, in the sense that give him 2 years, maybe 3, he'll be in your top 4 by then.
Yeah, and his skating is so good too, right? Like, that's definitely something I could recognize, and I'm not that smart. But it was just the rest of it where I didn't necessarily see the offense. And, as a defenseman, there's more to your game than offense, obviously. But when you're talking about someone being able to be in that kind of top 5, top 6, hell, I think I even saw some comments in the Black Book from hockeyprospect.com that said, like, some people would even think about taking him like 4th or 3rd. Like, some people really like this guy. And my worry is that word you used, safe, comes into play a lot. And I'm not necessarily sure that's how you want to play a top 5 pick. Although, I mean, my job isn't on the line at the draft, so that's probably easier for me to say than like a Tom Fitzgerald. But like, I look at like a Nikita Okachuk, for example, 2nd-round pick from last year's draft. To me, that was a safe pick and not necessarily my favorite of the draft. And I realized Shear wasn't here anymore, but that kind of organizational shift to like, we used to really swing for it. And then taking a 2nd-round pick that I see as someone safe makes me not worry that we're going to pick him, because I'm not even sure he'll be on the board depending on where we end up tonight. But he's just not my favorite. I should say that.
Yeah, I understand that. And I get that. He is, from what I've seen from him, it's very much a good defenseman is one that you don't notice. But there's no doubt that he's a really good prospect. No doubt. And it also, the contrary to what you just mentioned would be, yes, at the same, I'm going to take the other side just to, have some discussion. Yeah. At the same time, though, a top 5 pick, you need an NHL player out of that. And I think it's kind of a, what's the word? Self-flagellating practice of looking at revisionist history with draft classes. Because whether we like it or not, we have a philosophy here, you and me, that you draft BPA. But sometimes you are starved for defensemen. And I could see a team, not Ottawa, because Ottawa's actually got a very nice group of defensemen. Maybe, if Detroit falls, that was a comment in the Black Book by a scout, like Sanderson and Moritz Seider, and that's your top pair for the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and like we know Detroit isn't scared to swing, right? Or at least Yzerman's Detroit, because Seider kind of came out of nowhere last season.
Yeah.
And that's why they were kind of one of the teams where like they said, like, if they happen to go to win the lottery and pick first, it wouldn't be out of the question to see a team like Detroit pick even like a Tim Stützle first overall, which is like, that's some big brain thinking. But at the same time, like, there were a lot of really good players on the board when they took Seider, and he had a really good year. So
a really good year. I was hoping that he would fall somehow, but I don't know, because we didn't have another 1st-round pick. But
yeah, that'll be interesting. Who else on here do you think is interesting? Like, I know like Cole Perfetti is an amazing
I
player.
was just about to say Cole Perfetti, actually.
Yeah.
I think he's an X factor here. I don't know if he's going to go top 5. Well, that's a really dumb thing to say. I think he could absolutely go top 5 just because he's got a really good offensive flair and he's got a good offensive read of the game. Not blistering fast, but good on his edges and an offensive threat, to use another cliche. Like, very much just about every time he steps on the ice, he can make things happen.
Yeah, and he was the runner-up in the OHL scoring title to Marco Rossi on, I would say, not a much worse team, but definitely a worse team. And I did some.
Well, I mean, to be fair, though, sorry to interrupt.
No, go for it.
There were a lot of worse teams in Ottawa.
Fair, very fair. Yeah. That's Ottawa was kind of a unicorn this season and last, but I did some research into this for an article a couple weeks ago, comparing Rossi and Perfetti, because some people don't like Rossi, and I think that's fair. Like, the size comes into play. His skating isn't immaculate. There are a couple other things, but one of the narratives surrounding Marco Rossi was that he scored too many of his points against bad teams. And that was interesting to me. So I went and looked at the numbers and compared Rossi with Perfetti, and I also did Byfield, but that didn't make the article. And Rossi's production definitely did drop off from playing against poor teams to good teams. And Perfetti's goal scoring actually increased against good teams, which I thought was hilarious because he had less of a supporting cast, and he actually managed to increase his offense against the better teams in the OHL. So that's really interesting to me, because that suggests to me that he's very much a play driver, which is just something you want in a top 10 pick. And the thought that a player like Perfetti could be available at 8 or 9, like, that's basically the person I'm thinking of when I think that, like, even if the Devils drop 1, 2, maybe even 3 spots today, we're going to be fine because there's going to be a kid like Perfetti available. Maybe not him, because I think, like you mentioned, he has the potential to go as high as 5 or so. But there are definitely players like that.
Yeah, I think I should also mention 2 other players here. I really do like Anton Lundell.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, I just see him and I think Minnesota Wild, even though the Wild are not going to be in a position to draft him.
Yeah, no, that's a very fair thing, though, because, like, he's got that defensive edge to him.
Yeah.
He's a bit unorthodox, and he's already kind of cut his chops against men, right? Because he was playing professional this year in Finland.
He's got a very good wrist shot too.
Yeah,
so it's
I
not
like
just
that
defensive. A lot. Yeah. So yeah, he's a really interesting prospect to follow. The other guy that I wanted to mention was Noel Gunler. I have him at 14. This is one of those, again, like, I wasn't sure where to put him just because he does have very high upside, but I don't think it's quite. I don't see the likelihood of him reaching that upside as high as the others on this list.
So more of a boomer bust kind of guy.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah. One thing I have to ask you about, and I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but there's one person I don't see on this list that others might expect to see.
Maybe I forgot. Okay.
A goalie.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
no. This is good because I'm not good with evaluating goalies.
Because there are some people that say he's a top 10 pick.
Yeah.
And then others, like, I'm not sure anyone doubts his ability. It's more a consideration of risk versus draft position. Because I was a guest on a podcast last week, and basically said, like, I think he's talented. Like you, I have no idea about goalies, but smart people that I trust tell me that he's talented. But at the same time, I think the only place where I would take him would be so far into the draft that he wouldn't be available. Like, basically, like, late teens, early 20s, that sort of thing. That's kind of where I sit, but he's definitely well thought of.
Yeah, I would say that he was very much on my mind when writing this or when making this list, just because it is important to know that he is one of the most, I say, hyped, not to diminish his skill, but just to say that how much fanfare he's had since his development, or over the path of his development. He's probably the most hyped goaltending prospect since Carey Price.
Wow. Yeah. No, I could see that though. Like,
so last year we had Spencer Knight
Mhm.
get drafted by the Panthers. What was that, 10th overall?
yeah, it was within the top 15.
Yeah, that's fair. Within top 15. It has not been very often though that teams drafting goalies in the first round have found success, but that's not to hold him. What am I saying? That's not to be held against him for the sins of goalies past.
Yeah. Yeah, he's very athletic. His performances to date have been excellent, barring maybe the World Junior Championship where he didn't do all that well. But
yeah, and that's a 6-7 game tournament.
Yeah.
People put a lot of stock into that, which is fair because it's the first time a lot of folks get to see these international prospects or that play in the Russian leagues. But I mean, at the same time, though, you could also point to last year, Askarov just absolutely stonewalling at the U18 championships, the best U.S. National Development Program team assembled to date.
Yep. I wonder how thrilled Jack Hughes would be to see him if the Devils draft him. It's like, you again. But yeah, that's fair. How far out of the top 15? Like, how far off of this list?
He's knocking on the door here. I would say 16 or 17.
Okay, that's fair. Very fair. Anyone else on this list that you want to talk about? I'm curious about Jack Quinn because he's interesting to me too. Yeah. He's another of the 67s.
Jack Quinn is a really fun player to watch. Awesome goal scorer. Developed some kind of power forward game. The biggest question I have, though, is, and this is probably not fair just because of how stacked Ottawa was, but he spent most of his time against second pairing defensemen and whatnot. So Rossi and his line took the brunt of the top defensive assignments.
Mm-hmm. Do you think Jack Quinn is a top 20 pick this year if Graham Clark isn't injured?
Oh, that's a good question.
Because it seems like he really took the spot that all of us thought Graham Clark would have, right? Like, I think Clark scored like 9 goals in his first 6 or 7 games, and then had that shoulder injury.
Celebrating a goal. What a champ.
Yeah,
that's a good
I'm just
question.
Curious, because
I still think so. Yeah, I still think so. Maybe the later, much closer towards 20, just because there wouldn't be that much exposure. But I still think so because the skill comes through.
Oh yeah, and it's amazing to see someone take advantage of that opportunity. It's just his goal totals jumped so much from last season to this season, but he obviously had an opportunity open up in front of him and took advantage, which is that's exactly what you're supposed to do, right? People get injured in hockey all the time. He's interesting, and like talking about need, like one thing this team needs, the Devils, is a volume shooter, a goal scorer, and a right wing. So we know the Devils have seen a lot of the 67s because they basically have half the team. I'm curious how high Quinn is on the list.
Yeah. So that is my top 15. If anybody here has any questions, as in like the chat or whatnot, because we've got almost 30 people watching. Holy
nice.
Heck.
I'm glad this worked because last year we tried to stream to YouTube and failed miserably.
Yeah.
I'm glad we got it working this year.
So it's funny because we actually we had our own little stream of Zoom, which was very much ahead of our time, apparently.
Yeah, we were early adopters. We're the Zoom hipsters.
That's right. We did it before everybody else did, guys. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, just one more thing. I keep interrupting you, Duncan.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I just want to mention to everybody that, we're very privileged to be able to do this and, be able to set aside a couple hours to talk about hockey and just react to it. But we've been keeping a bit of a radio silence just because we wanted to. There are more important things happening right now, and I just want to let all of you know that in our description, we don't do this for money, but in our description for the YouTube video, there are some links for local food banks. The Feeding America one is you can put in your zip code and find a local food bank to donate. The Food Pantries one is one more towards where I'm at. And if you can, like $1, maybe $2 goes a really long way if you can. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I think that's important. And you're right, like there have been much more important things than hockey going on. So yeah, if you have the ability, that's greatly appreciated. I did see a question in the chat from, who was it? Dean on YouTube about Rodion Amirov. And I think that's a perfect segue to my top 15 list, because he sneaks in there in kind of the third tier. He's a really interesting player that I like a lot. Now, I think there might be some hot takes on this list, so you'll have to bear with me. But
I'm ready.
I see him as one of those kind of 10 to 20 picks, and there's a lot of players in there that are probably interchangeable. But yeah, this is where I land, and I think it's pretty similar until like pick 9 to your list, and that's kind of where things take a right turn. Which probably means there's a few things wrong here, but I did put Sanderson here, even though my personal opinion isn't necessarily as positive as others. I love Seth Jarvis, and I saw you had him on your list as well. But yeah, Amirov is a player that I think is really intriguing, coming out of Russia. That does a lot of things really well. I think his transition game is really cool, and I also snuck another German onto this list at the end. Lukas Reichel.
A fantastic skater.
Right, there's three big Germans in this draft, and they're probably all first-round picks. Is that fair to say?
Yeah,
I think Paterka is probably also a first-rounder.
I think so.
But Lukas Reichel, I think, is really interesting. But yeah, this is where I end up. I think we're basically the same until 9, if not exactly the same. Maybe Holtz and Drysdale are switched or something. But yeah, Seth Jarvis in particular, I think is interesting because he had like a really dominant season in the WHL. And I was like reading and watching some stuff from Will Scouch at Scouching about Seth Jarvis. And he said he basically does one thing well, but he does it insanely well, which is pass to high danger areas on the ice. He isn't necessarily a person that takes a ton of high danger shots. He does go to the middle of the ice, which is good, but the sheer volume of passes he makes to high danger areas is just outrageous. So I think that's an interesting habit to have, because sometimes you see prospects that are very efficient, but don't necessarily push the pace of play to like those high danger areas. And I think it's interesting that Jarvis is up there. I think JJ Paterka, like the third German that didn't make the cut, is one of those more like efficient players that is probably much more safe than they are dynamic, I guess. Those are all kind of hockey buzzwords that I'm not sure actually mean anything at this point, but we'll use them anyways. But Jarvis is definitely one of those guys that really pushes it. I also included Askarov because, I don't necessarily know any better, and that's where people have him. So I didn't want to push him out just because of my lack of opinion. And Braden Schneider, I think, is an interesting defenseman as well. Although I imagine that, once you get past Drysdale and Sanderson, there are probably 2 or 3 other defensemen that you could take realistically in the teens, and it's probably just team preference at that point. But there are some of them that I think are much more risky than others. Anything here that pisses you off, Ian?
We do have exactly the same top 5. I think top 6.
And I have to admit, it was painful for me to put Rossi behind Lucas Raymond,
Yeah,
just because of my personal affection for him.
and
But
also,
I
sorry.
no, I think it's just I think it's true that Raymond does have a higher ceiling, and in a weird way, and this is strange to say about a player that's 5'9", he might be the safer pick between the
Yeah,
two in a strange way. Because I think you're right. I think if center doesn't work out because of size, you could easily put him to the wing, and he'd be a really interesting playmaking, defensively responsible, pain in the ass winger. So I don't know. Raymond does seem like if he weren't to hit his ceiling, he might be a less useful player.
I'm right there with you. I had to think a lot to put Raymond in front of Rossi, just because Rossi, like we said earlier, he's got the smarts, he's got the defensive acumen, he's got the lower body strength, and he's got the ability to just rack up points.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question in chat about Jaime Drysdale. If we think he's built in Quinn Hughes's mold. That's interesting because I've heard people give warnings about Drysdale. Not that he's a bad player, but to say that if you expect Quinn Hughes or Cale Makar, you might walk away disappointed. Do you think that's fair?
Um, that is a tough question. I think there's definitely a lot of projection of Cale Makar on Drysdale just because of his skating ability and how he just kind of gallops around the ice. And Quinn Hughes is more of like a water bug, I think. We're being really pedantic here.
Well, that's what it always comes to, right? Because you know, I feel like it is very subjective. I mean, if you do what Will Scouch does and start to really crunch the numbers, I think you can start to move past that a little bit. But when it comes to actual descriptive words, it's absolutely pedantic. But I do think he is a bit different than a Quinn Hughes. I'm trying to think of like a comparable that actually comes to mind because I feel like his skating ability is in a different mold than like a Cale Makar or even a Hughes because he's just extremely efficient. I don't know, like he isn't necessarily going to like blow you away with his skating, but it's just like to me at least, and like when I've seen him come through town, has been basically immaculate. If not like pull you out of your seat, he just gets it done. And I saw like when I've seen him, he's made very good decisions with the puck. I've heard that that's not always the case, but I do love him for that.
Yeah. Dean in the chat has a really good segue to our next couple slides, but I do want to quick address something that a question was asked about water bug, which is one of my vague, broad tendencies, slang words, and what I mean by water bug is just kind of like a Sam Girard type player where he's very, he's not quite as powerful with his skating, his straightaway speed, but his angles and his east-west ability is excellent, and he uses that a lot to kind of like zip around, so to speak.
Yeah, like just like one of those creepy bugs on the water, right? They're just zipping around. You can't quite pin them down. I think that's fair. We do have a hot take alert or a potential one from John in chat. I'd say Stützle for need and talent at 2. I get the feeling Byfield ends up closer to Evander Kane than to Evgeny Malkin. I think that's interesting.
That's an interesting one. I think Kane is a lot meaner of a player than Byfield. I mean, then again, Malkin's a mean player too.
He's not a saint.
No,
definitely not.
By the way, this is not any kind of hot take or anything, but angry Evgeny Malkin is, I think, the best hockey player in the league.
Angry Evgeny Malkin when Crosby's injured.
Yeah.
Like,
that's when the stars align.
Yeah, that's good stuff.